The human voice returned. It remained utterly calm, which somehow made it far more threatening than any declaration of war could have been. This is your final warning. Turn back. What happens next is your choice, not ours. Dreth-Kaal stood at the viewport for a long time. He looked at the wall of human ships. He looked at the space behind his fleet, still open. He thought about what turning back would mean, not just a tactical retreat, but the political devastation, the signal it would send to every empire watching from the edges of the galaxy. He thought about what had been whispered in the outer systems, the rumors that Earth was soft, that humans were young and frightened, that their world would fall before their own star could set twice. He had believed those rumors. His pride would not let them die quietly. All ships, he said, his voice harder than it had been before, compensating for the doubt coiling beneath it. Advance. Full battle formation. We end this now. And that was when humanity's patience ran out. The trap did not roar to life. It whispered. Space around the alien armada began to glow, faintly at first, barely perceptible, like the bioluminescence of a deep-sea creature stirring from sleep. Then the glow intensified, and the Vorrkai realized with dawning horror that the light was coming from everywhere. From behind them, from their flanks, from directly beneath their formation. Millions of minds, invisible to every instrument they possess, powered on in sequence, forming a constellation of destruction around the armada so dense and so precisely arranged that it made their weapon systems look primitive by comparison. Energy grids materialized between the defense platforms like luminous spider webs drawn across the stars. The region of space the armada occupied, the region they had marched confidently into, was no longer open. It was a room, and humanity had just closed the door. The first alien battleship erupted in silence, the explosion visible only as a bloom of white light and expanding debris. Then another. Then 5 at once, their hulls shearing apart under weapons fire so precise it seemed less like combat and more like surgery. The human fleet advanced with the quiet efficiency of a machine that had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Their ships moved in perfect coordination, each vessel covering the others, none of them wasting a single shot. Thin beams of concentrated white light cut through Vorrkai shields, as though the shields were decorative rather than functional. Missiles traveling in coordinated swarms arrived from multiple angles simultaneously, defeating targeting systems designed to handle threats from a single direction. There was no bravado, no war cries transmitted on open channels. The humans fought in professional silence, and somehow that silence was the most unnerving thing of all. Alien commanders screamed orders into their communication systems. Retreat vectors were plotted and immediately abandoned as the mine grid sealed the escape routes. Hyperspace drives engaged and then failed. Their navigation system suddenly locked, jammed by signals embedded in the very satellites the Vorrkai had dismissed as primitive hours ago. Every option led to the same realization, arriving in the minds of different officers at different moments but carrying identical weight. They had never been attacking Earth. They had walked into a trap so large they had mistaken it for open space. A massive Vorrkai carrier, the pride of their 3rd Division, carrying enough firepower to glass a continent, angled toward the center of the human wall and charge its main cannon. The weapon took 30 seconds to reach full power, and in those 30 seconds, 3 thin beams of white light traveled across the distance between the human battleship and the carrier's core. They struck simultaneously. The carrier split along its entire length, both halves spiraling outward in a slow, terrible arc, the explosion painting the face of Mars in shades of orange and gold. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, alarms had become a constant, meaningless noise. Damage reports arrived faster than the officers could read them. Entire divisions had ceased to appear on the tactical display, not because the display was malfunctioning, but because the divisions no longer existed. The armada that had crossed half the galaxy in confidence was being disassembled with methodical, unhurried precision. Retreat! Dreth-Kaal roared, abandoning every pretense of calm, his voice cracking at the edges. All vessels retreat, break formation, anything. But the retreat he ordered was a direction that no longer existed. The largest human vessel, a battleship so massive it generated its own gravitational shadow, moved forward from the center of the wall. It had not fired a single shot until this moment. It had simply waited, the way a closing statement waits until every other argument has been made. It fired once. The shields of the Eternal Dominion failed, as though they had never been raised. The blast struck amidships, and Dreth-Kaal was thrown from his command platform, hitting the deck hard, one of his arms giving way beneath him. The lights on the bridge flickered into emergency red. Through the cracked viewport, he could see his fleet, what remained of it, drifting, burning, coming apart at the seams like a story that had been told wrong. On every screen aboard every surviving Vorrkai vessel, the same message appeared. Not a taunt, not a proclamation of victory. Simply a statement of fact, delivered with the same quiet certainty that had characterized the humans throughout this entire engagement. You were stopped at Mars. You never came close. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less time than it had taken the Armada to cross the final distance to Mars. On Earth, in the cities below, people went about their lives entirely unaware. Children looked up at the sky and saw only the stars. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Dreth-Kaal had ever experienced. He knelt on the floor of his ruined bridge and looked through the fractured viewport at what had become of the greatest armada the Vorrkai had assembled in 3 centuries. Drifting wreckage. Fires burning briefly in the vacuum before the cold extinguished them. The slow, graceful tumble of broken ships across the face of Mars. Human rescue drones moved through the debris with calm efficiency, scanning for survivors, collecting escape pods, doing what the humans had apparently decided to do despite everything. Preserve life where it could be preserved. Surviving officers were gathered with controlled, professional force. No cruelty, no celebration. Just quiet, purposeful work. Dreth-Kaal was taken aboard a human vessel and brought to a room that was stark and clean and utterly ordinary. He sat across a simple table from the human fleet admiral, a woman of middle age with gray in her hair and a stillness in her eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of deep space. You hit everything, he said at last, because he needed to understand. Your entire defense network. How long? She looked at him for a moment before answering. Long enough, she said. We detected only satellites, a patrol fleet. We know what you detected, she said simply. We planned for it. He studied her face and found nothing that satisfied the questions crowding behind his eyes. No arrogance, no gloating, no triumphant fire. Just the calm of someone who had done what needed to be done and was already thinking about what came next. Why didn't you simply destroy us all? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Because we're not you, she said. The message went out across the galaxy the following day. Every empire, every war council, every fleet admiral lounging in confidence of their own power received the same transmission simultaneously. The image was simple, the wreckage of the Vorrkai Armada suspended in the reddish glow near Mars, broken and still. And then the human admiral's voice, clear and unhurried, as it had been throughout the entire engagement. Earth does not seek war. We have never sought war. But understand this, any fleet that approaches our home with hostile intent will not reach it. They will not see our cities. They will not enter our atmosphere. They will be stopped, as these ships were stopped, at Mars. And Mars is only the first line. The transmission ended without ceremony. In distant systems, war councils fell silent. Star maps with Earth marked as a target were quietly revised. The whispered intelligence reports that had described humanity as a soft, young species, reports that had seemed so credible, so thoroughly researched, were re-examined with new and uncomfortable eyes. Questions were asked that had not been asked before. What else have they hidden? How far does their defense network extend? What awaits at Jupiter? At Saturn? The answers, it turned out, were unknowable, and that uncertainty was more effective than any show of force could have been. Days passed. The wreckage was cleared. The broken alien ships were studied, their technology catalogued and understood. The surviving Vorrkai officers were treated with a courtesy that confused them, and then they were released, escorted to the edge of human space in a single transport vessel, their escape pods restocked, their wounds treated. They were sent home with one instruction. Tell them what you saw, not what they had feared, not what they had imagined, what they had actually seen. In the quiet of the Fleet Command Center aboard the human flagship, the Admiral stood before a star map that stretched from Earth's sun to the edges of charted space. She had not slept in 30 hours, but the stillness in her eyes remained. A young officer approached. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions. "Some of them might," she said. "Eventually. Arrogance is stubborn, but they'll come differently now. Carefully, and careful is something we know how to handle. The officer looked at the star map, at the hidden platforms near Jupiter, the defense stations tucked within Saturn's rings, the listening posts scattered beyond Pluto like seeds in the dark. The entire network, invisible from the outside, patient and deep and vast, built over generations by people who had looked up at the stars and understood, before they ever reached them, that they would not be alone. We could expand, the officer said quietly, offensively. After what just happened, no one would stop us. The Admiral shook her head. That's how they think, she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only clarity. That's exactly how every empire in this galaxy thinks. And that's why every empire eventually falls. She turned off the section of the map showing the outer defense layers and brought up Earth instead. The cities, the oceans, the thin blue line of atmosphere wrapped around everything that humanity had ever built or dreamed or loved. We build outward, she said softly, so that what's here never has to be touched. The galaxy learned its lesson in the way that lessons carved by fire are always learned, slowly and not entirely, and with a lingering disbelief that makes a lesson occasionally worth repeating. But the core of it settled into the consciousness of every spacefaring civilization within reach of the transmission, and it changed things in ways that would not fully be understood for generations. They could study Earth from a distance. They could whisper about it in their councils. They could map its star and calculate its resources and imagine, in their most grandiose moments, what it would mean to claim it. But no fleet set a course for Earth without remembering what had come of the last one. And the humans, who had watched so many of their own centuries of history unfold in blood and ruin, who had promised themselves, in the aftermath of their worst moments, that they would do better, be smarter, build something worth the cost of what they had learned. The humans continued, quietly and without announcement, to extend their reach further into the dark, not to conquer, to ensure that when the next shadow crossed the deep, it would meet the same patience, the same precision, and the same simple, unanswerable truth. You were stopped at Mars, and Mars is only the beginning. The alien armada arrived without hesitation, without fear, and without mercy. Thousands of warships tore through the fabric of hyperspace and materialized near the orbit of Mars like a storm front made of steel and shadow. They were enormous, black monoliths bristling with weapons, their hulls carved from materials forged in the hearts of dying stars. Their engines burned a deep, violent blue, like twin suns trapped behind iron. These were not explorers. They were not diplomats. They were conquerors, seasoned by centuries of unopposed expansion, carrying the weight of 1,000 fallen civilizations in their wake. The Vorrkai, as they called themselves, had never lost a war. They had never even come close. High Commander Dreth-Kaal stood at the panoramic viewport of the flagship Eternal Dominion, his forearms clasped behind his armored back, his compound eyes fixed on the small blue sphere suspended in the distance like a fragile jewel. He had stood in the same posture above dozens of worlds before their surrender. It never grew old. Primitive species, he said, his voice carrying the bald certainty of a predator who has never known prey worth fearing. This will be finished before their star completes a quarter tone. His officers did not disagree. Why would they? Their long-range scanners showed only scattered human activity, a thin constellation of defense satellites, a modest patrol fleet, nothing that registered as a serious threat. The readings were almost insulting. Some of his younger officers were laughing quietly among themselves. Dreth-Kaal allowed it. Today was hardly worthy of solemnity. He did not order full battle systems to activate. There was no point in wasting energy on a species that had barely managed to colonize their own moon. The Armada advanced. Mars drifted slowly between the fleet and Earth, its rust-colored face scarred and silent. The formation moved with practiced grace. 10,000 warships in perfect geometric array, a moving mountain range of destruction cutting through the dark. Then a scout ship vanished. No explosion, no distress signal, no debris spiraling outward into the void. It was simply there one moment and absent the next, as though space itself had quietly swallowed it. Dreth-Kaal's eyes narrowed. Malfunction, he said flatly. Record it and move on. But before the words had finished leaving his mouth, 3 more ships disappeared. Then another 5. Then 2 destroyers in rapid succession, vessels the size of city blocks, gone between one breath and the next, leaving nothing behind but empty coordinates and a growing silence on the command deck. The laughter among the officers had stopped. Long-range scanners began to behave strangely. Signals bounced back wrong, as though the readings themselves were confused. Gravity measurements shifted without any detectable source. Something was moving in the shadow of Mars, something vast and patient, but the visual screen showed nothing. Just a red planet, just the dark, just the stars. "Commander," the scanner officer began, her voice unsteady. Another destroyer vanished. Mid-sentence. "Gone." Dreth-Kaal did not speak for a long moment. He stared at the place where his ship had been, where there was now only a pocket of empty space. Something moved in the deep architecture of his confidence, a hairline fracture, subtle and cold. "Slow the advance," he ordered. "Full scan. Maximum depth." The science teams worked urgently, pushing their instrument beyond their comfortable parameters. For one brief, flickering second, the deep scanners caught something extraordinary, thousands upon thousands of tiny objects arranged with geometric precision inside the shadow of Mars, motionless, invisible, waiting. Then the signal vanished, as though it had never existed. Before anyone could speak, a calm human voice broke across every open channel simultaneously. It was unhurried, unbothered, the voice of someone who had been expecting this. "You should not have come this far." The bridge of the eternal dominion went very, very quiet. And then Mars moved. Not physically, not yet, but the shadow the planet cast across the deep began to shift as the Armada's angle of approach changed, and as the darkness peeled back, Dreth-Kaal saw something that made the ancient, battle-hardened certainty in his chest begin to crack. It was not a fleet. It was a wall, stretching across the span of space behind Mars like a metal horizon born from humanity's collective will, a line of warships so vast, so perfectly ordered, that for a moment Dreth-Kaal's mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him. Battleships the size of small moons, destroyers arranged in layered formations like the scales of some enormous armored creature, heavy carriers flanked by swarms of autonomous fighters, still and silent, waiting for the command that would awaken them. And behind them, anchored in deep orbit like ancient fortresses, were defense platforms built directly into the bodies of captured asteroids, hollowed out, armored, weaponized, invisible to Vorrkai sensors until this exact moment. They had been there the entire time, hidden, patient, breathing in the dark. Dreth-Kaal's scanner officer turned from her console with an expression he had never seen on her face before. "Commander," she said quietly, "there are more of them than there are of us."